Hello, and welcome to all to today's webinar titled Quantities and Materials. I am Nicola Migliore. I am the Product Development Manager for the Vcad project at Belogic. And during today's presentation, we'll be having a look at how we can extract quantities and materials from our models and use them inside of our reports thanks to Vcad. For those of you who don't know, Vcad is the solution that allows users to connect their BIM models with their Power BI reports. As always, at the end of the presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and drop them in the question panel, and we'll get to them at the end. During the presentation, my colleague Francesco Necciari will answer some of the simpler questions, and then all of the others we'll talk about at the very end. With that said, let's get started with the presentation. So today, I've set up my project folder. In here, we have a couple assets that we may use, and then we have a quantities and materials starter PBIT file. We also have a report that I want to show you at the very end, but for now, let's start with this Power BI template starter. This is simply one of Vcad's regular Power BI report templates that we always have available when we're using Vcad. All I've done is I've renamed it, and when I created the template, I made note of using a specific file. The file is a Revit file, and because during the presentation we're going to be managing rooms and spaces, I made it a point to extract or download, I should say, the template based on a Revit phase and not based on a Revit view. Now, when the template opens up, as always, we're presented with the summary that gives us a bit of an overview of the model that we're using and some of the information contained. And then we have the regular Vcad report tabs. Now let's talk a little about what the scenario that we're looking at today is. So we want to be talking about quantities and materials. And to do so, we're going to be creating two report pages. The first one focuses on rooms. And specifically for the rooms, we're going to be looking at the various dimensions available. And then in the second case, we're going to focus in on walls of our building. And for those walls, we're going to be talking about the materials used to construct them. Now, before we can start the actual report creation, we need to go and have a look at the transformation of the data. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the properties table, and I'll show you in a second. So here we have our assets table. As always with Vcad, we have a list of all of the objects inside of our model. And if we go and we have a look at the Vcad properties table, we have the usual normalized structure. So I won't go too much into detail of this structure because we've addressed it in the past. But if we have a look at one of the properties that we're going to be using, specifically the area, for example, you'll see that for my dimension of area for all my objects, I have a value. However, I don't know the unit of measurement right now. So the first thing we're going to do is pull out that unit of measurement. To do so, as I said, let's go to the transformation of the data. So let's remove this filter and head on over to the transform data section. Now we can focus on the Vcad properties table. And to retrieve that information, I'll show you how we get to this point in the data. So the report starts, as always, in Vcad with the download of the various data sets that are available. Then we focus in on the properties table. We explore the content, and then we go and we basically explode the CSV file that contains all of our information. Now, you don't need to worry about all of these previous steps. Vcad takes care of those automatically for you if you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of how everything works. But one thing to have a look at is in this step right here, you can see we're opening up the CSV document and we're telling Power BI, go ahead and take the first 4 columns. Now, if we actually also add the 5th column, you can see that we have another column called data type context. And if we skip to the very last transformation step, we can see that here we have units of measurements for some of the properties. Of course, only for the properties that actually have a unit of measurement as part of the data set. Now, if we look at these units of measurement, for example, here we can read Autodesk unit, meters centimeters 100. Basically, this is a meter. However, it's using the technical term that Autodesk uses internally, and it's not very user-friendly. So let's do a simple transformation to make it a little more readable. There's various ways we could do this. We could add a custom column. We could use a function, stuff like that. For today, we're keeping it easy. We're just going to replace the value. So first off, first value you want to replace is this meters that I was just talking about. So I'm simply going to paste in the value to replace and then give it a value that it's supposed to put. So just a simple M for meters. Here we go. Next up, let's do it also for the square meters, which are going to be used by our area properties. So replace values, give it the value it's supposed to replace, and then the new value. There we go, and we can see we have our squared meters, and we're going to do the same thing for our cubic meters. So last replace, and we're good to go. So now you see we have our units of measurement in a way that our users can actually understand and use. Okay, so we're going to leave the properties table as is. Now, let's get to our first scenario. So we're going to be focusing on rooms. I was saying to do that, let's create a new data set. We could simply use the Vcad asset table. However, to keep everything a little more neat and more compatible with the rest of my report, I'm going to create a new data set. So down here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new query, and I'm going to use a blank query. Now, if I go over to the advanced editor, I'm going to give it a source, and I'm going to tell it to pull from the Vcad asset. This will basically allow me to start from the dataset in the Vcad asset without having to repeat all of the transformation steps that were made in that other dataset. Okay, so this list contains all of the objects defined in my model. However, as I said, I only want to focus in on the rooms. I can do that by filtering the category column. Let's load all of the options and simply filter based on rooms. And now we have drastically reduced the actual asset data set. Before I forget, let's rename this table to rooms, okay? And let's clean up the table from all the information that we're not going to need. So all this classification, category, family, symbol, the parent object, even the external ID, in this case, we're not going to use. In other scenarios, you may want to use that information. Specifically, the external ID may be very useful if you're trying to connect external data sources, but for now, we're not going to use it, so let's go ahead and remove this column. And so now I simply have a table with my object ID and the actual name of my object. And these are all rooms, so I actually have the name of the room. Now let's add some properties to this data set. To do that, I'm going to merge queries, and I'm going to add in the Vcad properties table. I'm going to match the two through the object ID, and press OK. And then I'm going to expand the table I have. Of this table here, I'm not interested in the object ID or in the section. I will keep name, value, and data context. And let's remove the prefix. Okay, great. So now we have our properties. Let's again filter the data set for only the properties that we're actually interested in. So here, what we're going to be looking at, let's load all of them. For our rooms is, as I said, we want our dimensions. So we want the area, we want the perimeter, and the volume. Last thing is I'm going to also add the occupancy. So the occupancy is going to basically tell us what the room is being used for. Let's go ahead and press OK. Okay, and here we can see now basically what we have is for every room, we have multiple rows, one for each property, area, perimeter, volume, and occupancy. Okay. Now, we're going to want to pivot this information, but before we do that, you can see that my dimension information, so area, perimeter, and volume, all have a unit of measurement, whereas the occupancy, of course, does not. Let's create a new column that merges these two information when it is a dimension or when it is an occupancy. So to do that, I'm going to go to Add Column, and I'm going to add a custom column. My new column is simply going to be called Property Name. And for the function, I have prepared a function that I'll just drop in. We can go over what it's doing. So basically, in my function, I'm checking if name.1, which is my property name, if the property name is equals to perimeter, then I'm going to print out the property name, i.e. the perimeter, then some parentheses, and the unit of measurement. Same goes for area and for volume. Finally, in every other case, I'm simply going to print out the property name. So if we press OK, we can see here I have area, square meters, perimeter meters, volume, cubic meters. Occupancy instead doesn't have anything else added. Okay, now we can remove these two columns. We're not going to need them anymore. And now we can go ahead and pivot this new column that we have and spread it over multiple columns. So to do that, I'm going to select the column, head on over to Transform tab, and then Pivot Column. For the value, of course, I want to use my value column. And in the advanced options, I want to remember to tell it to not aggregate the rest of the information. Press OK. Now the transformation is going to be applied to my data set, and what I will have is a single row for each room with the dimensions and the occupancy. And let's actually move these around a little, just so it's a little cleaner. So we have the occupancy, then the perimeter, the area, and the volume. For these last three, another thing we want to do is actually change the type for the column. So right now they're text. I'm going to go ahead and change type and tell it to give it a decimal number because I know they are a numeric number, a numeric value. And this will allow Power BI to then do some smarter use of the information and manage it as an actual number. Okay, so now we have a table with our information. Let's head on to the report page and let's start using this information. So I can close and apply. Now, the data sets that I've interacted with are going to be refreshed. The steps are going to be reapplied. That way I have my new rooms table that I can use. Okay, great. Now let's create our new report page. Usually what I like to do is start with a pre-existing report page and duplicate it. The asset detail page will work just fine for me. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this page. Let's rename it right away. Okay, and also change the title. Okay, so now let's have a look at our report. So here we're seeing my model. So in this case, it was a building. However, we can see that the visual is now highlighting every object in the model, whereas I only want to focus in on the rooms. That's because right now, if we go into the data bindings for my custom visual, we can see it's pulling from the Vcad asset table. What I wanted to do instead is to pull from my new rooms table. So I can go ahead and I can clear out this file, this binding, sorry. And for my rooms table, I can drag in the object ID. Now, when the viewer refreshes, it'll only highlight the actual rooms instead of every single geometry in my model. Okay, and if we actually hide the rest of the model or go into X-ray mode like this, we can actually focus in and see the specific rooms that we're interacting with. Now let's go ahead and use our new rooms table in the rest of the report page. So for example, this asset list, right now, it's pulling all of its information from that Vcad asset table. Let's go ahead and remove all of these. And let's instead pull from my rooms table. For starters, let's give it the actual room name. Then we can give it the perimeter, the area, and the volume. Now, because I've set up these columns as decimals, the Power BI table was smart enough to understand that it should also add the totals to the bottom. This, of course, can all be configured in the specific options of the table component. For now, we'll just leave it like this. Now, before we head on any further in our report creation, there's one step we should probably make to check our new data set, and that is to see what connections it has to the rest of the data model. So if I come over to the model section, all the way to the right, we can see I have my new rooms table. If I just move this over a little, there we go. We can see that Power BI automatically created a connection between the rooms table and the asset table through the object ID, which is formally correct. However, it isn't useful for the purposes of my report in this specific case. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this connection. And a more useful connection would be connecting the levels table and the rooms. So I'm going to do that always through the object ID. Here we go. Now I won't go too much into detail on how this works. Again, we've covered this in previous presentations and in videos on our YouTube page. So if you want any more information, there's plenty out there that you can sort of search up. Just the thing you need to know is that now we're basically able to tell which floor every room is on. So if we go back to our report, we can actually use this information. Let's clear out some room, for example. So let's just remove this. This one we can stretch out a bit. And here for the category, we're not interested in the category filter because I know everything is a room. Instead, I can pull from the levels table. So let's just pull the level name. Okay. And now, if I filter, well, let's make this a little larger. That way we can read. Okay. So now I can select one of the various floors or levels that were defined in my original Revit model. And I can review the spaces or the rooms in that specific floor, like we're doing here. Let's just hide everything else. That way we can really focus in on the rooms. Okay, great. Now another type of filter that could be handy, and we can replace this symbol filter over here, is the occupancy. So for my rooms, I know what every room is used for. Let's just stretch this over a bit. And now I can, for example, focus in on the offices in the 2 floors that I'm looking. And you can see, of course, the table over here is now filtering based on these selections that I'm making. Or for example, I could try and see where the cubicles are or stuff like that. And meantime, I'm seeing the totals being automatically updated in real time. Now, let's see something else we can do with this information. Let's add another visual, another graphical visual. Instead of this property matrix, let's drop in a clustered bar chart. And I specifically want to use this visual because it has a handy feature, which I'll show you in a moment. For now, let's just say that based on the occupancy of my spaces, of my rooms, I want to know what these area is, so square meters it occupies. Now, of course, I have my filter on the occupancy, so I'm only seeing one value. Let's remove this filter. And I can see on the 2 floors that I'm looking at, the most of the area is being used by cubicles, followed by circulation spaces, and next up offices, and so on for all the others. Okay, so this is pretty good. I've created a connection between my model and my data. I can filter one and the other. I'd like to go a little deeper and have a better representation of what type of spaces are occupying my building. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a theme. We've talked a lot about themes in the past, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on all of the possibilities. I'm just going to go really quick and define a theme. If you want more information, again, there's plenty on our website and our YouTube page. To create a theme, let's go to the transform data section. Let's pull up my new rooms dataset. here, let's create a theme based on the occupancy information. So to do that, I can select my occupancy color. I can go ahead and group based on this column. Let's call our new color TMP group. I'm going to then delete this column later. And as an operation, I don't want to apply any operation to the rest of the data. I simply want to create a subtable. So I can press OK. And now what I will have is a table with a row for every occupancy type and a series of subtables that include all the rest of the data. Now what I can do is I can add an index column. If I come over to add column, index column, let's just add one starting from 1. And I can then use this new index column to invoke one of Vcad's custom functions. So I can go to invoke custom function. Let's call this the occupancy color. And for example, let's use function number 2. These color functions that we make available simply take in as an input an index value, so a number, a simple number, and return a color. So if I apply that for each one of my occupancy types, I will have a specific color available. There we go. And we can see the color code changes for every row. Now I can go ahead and remove these 2 columns. I don't need them anymore. And I can re-expand my subtables. I don't want a prefix, but I will take all of the columns. Press OK. Now what I will have is the table we had a while ago, plus the new occupancy color, which gives me a color based on the occupancy type. Let's go ahead, close and apply, and let's use this new information. Okay, so now the data set again is being refreshed. Now we have this new field over here, occupancy color. Now the reason I wanted to use the clustered bar chart is it has a handy feature. If we go over to the formatting options under columns, we could define a color for our bars, but more useful, we can actually pass in a function. So we can use a function to color it. If you come over here, I can tell it to color the bars based on a field value, and then pass in from my rooms table my new occupancy color. I can press OK, and you can see now we're feeding those new colors into the bars. And the nice thing is, of course, we can do all this also with our model. So to do that with Vcad, we're going to select the custom visual, go over to the formatting options, and then turn on the show theme color. When I did this, you see here I get my new theme selector. Now, of course, I don't have a theme yet. Before we switch over, let's go ahead and give it a default value. So I'm going to only define one theme. If I had multiple themes, however, here's where I could define which theme the model is supposed to be loaded with. So let's simply go with the first theme available. And finally, in the data bindings, under highlight color, I can drag in my new occupancy color. Now this makes it available up here. I can select the occupancy color and I can apply it to my model. And you can see that now the colors match between my bar chart and my model. Just to make this a little more neat, I can rename this for this visual. Let's just call it capital O and give it some space. Okay, so now it's a little neater up here. Great. So now we have the information of our rooms, how they're distributed over the entirety of my model. I know the dimensions of each one. So for each specific room, I can tell what the perimeter area and volume is. I can have a general idea over the entirety of my model, and I can go on a occupancy type basis and see that, for example, most of the space in my building is being subleased. And next up, I have over 2,000 square meters of cubicles inside of my building. Okay, so this is a simple example looking at rooms and dimensions. Of course, this can be done with a bunch of different use cases. Let's head on to the second use case, so quantities and materials. So let's go to the transform data section. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the walls of my building. So let's create a new data set like we did before. I'm going to go a little fast now because most of the operations are very similar to what we just did, but I want to showcase a couple of differences. So let's go with a blank query in the advanced editor. Let's give it a source, and we're going to start with our Vcad asset table again. I want to point out there are many different ways to achieve this same goal. For example, I could have started from the properties table and then filtered in the asset information, or I could have completely started from an external data set if I had that information on hand. In this case, we're just going to keep it simple, start with the asset and work our way from there. So kind of like what we did before, of all of the assets here, I'm only interested in the walls. So let's go ahead and filter out only the walls. Press OK. Okay, now we've reduced the data set. Let's go ahead and remove the information we don't need. I will keep the symbol this time because it is very helpful to distinguish the different types of walls I have in my building. But for the rest, I'm going to go ahead and remove them. Okay. Now again, I'm going to merge with the properties table. Before I do that, let's rename this new data set before I forget. Okay, now we can merge with the properties table. So Vcad properties and match with the objects. Again, several different ways I could have done this. I could have pre-created a copy of the properties table, which only had the properties for my walls, for example, but we're keeping it as simple as possible during this presentation. Let's go ahead and expand this table. And I'm only going to take name, value, and data type like we did before. Oh, and one thing, let's remove the prefix. Okay, great. So let's filter out only the properties that we're interested in. In this case, we're going to be looking at some different properties. Specifically, we want to have a look at the structural material used. This will give me the material used for the actual construction of the wall, and also the volume property, which will give me the volume of my object. No, sorry about that. Let's try that again. I didn't apply the actual filter. Okay, so let's remove them all. And of all of these, I only want the structural material and the volume. Here we go. Okay, perfect. So now for every wall, I have two properties, volume and structural material. Again, we have the name of the property on one side and the unit of measurement on another one. Let's create that property name column like we did before. And in fact, let's actually copy the same function we use. So if I go back to the rooms data set and I find where I added the custom column over here, if I click on the cog, I can see the function again. I'll just copy this, come back to my walls. Now tell it I want to add a custom column. A custom column will always be called property name. Okay, I'm going to paste in that function and change it up a little because of course in this case, we're not interested in perimeter and area. However, I do want to check for volume. So I'm just going to keep the case for volume, and in every other case, simply give me back the property name. Press OK. Here we go. We have our new column. I can go ahead and remove these old ones. And like before, I'm going to pivot based on this new property name column. So I'm going to go to transform, pivot column. As a value, I'm going to pass in the value and don't aggregate the rest of the data. Press OK. And now we'll have a single row for each wall, but multiple columns for the various properties that I've selected. Okay. Before we go forward, let's remember to change the data type of the volume column. So right click, change type, decimal number. Okay. Now what we can do is, let's have a look at the various materials that we have available. So for these walls, there's a bunch of different available materials. For this presentation, we're going to simplify a bit the case and focus in only on concrete walls and on brick walls. The actual end use case could be a little more elaborate, but we're going to try and keep it as simple as possible for the purposes of this presentation. So I'm going to need a way to identify which walls are made out of concrete, which ones are made out of brick, and which ones are made of any other material. And also, I'll have you notice that there are different types of concrete and different types of brick as well, because some take into consideration where the wall is placed and the wall's actual function. So let's go ahead and create a new column that will help me identify this information. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a custom column. I'm going to here, press OK. And I'm going to call this new column simple material, because this column is going to simplify the scenario and simply tell me if something is brick, if it's concrete, or if it's unknown. So to do that, I have a function. I'm going to paste it in here. And let's go through what it does. So basically, it's checking the structural material. It's making sure that it is not null. And then we're checking if the text contains the word concrete. And also, I'm turning the text to lowercase just to make sure that I don't have problems with case matching. If the structural material contains the word concrete, then I'm printing out concrete. Then I'm doing the same check for brick. If it contains brick, I'm printing out brick. And every other case, I'm simply printing out unknown. Now we can apply this function. And I have a simple column telling me if something is brick, concrete, or unknown. Now, as I said, we're simplifying the case, so I'm going to go and remove the unknowns. We're not going to manage them in this case. Press OK. And now what we have is a table containing the information of our walls that are either made out of brick or made out of concrete. Finally, let's go ahead and set up the theme, kind of like what we did in the previous case, but this time we're going to create a theme based on the structural material. So to do that, select the structural material column, group by this column. Again, I'm simply going to call this TMP group. I don't want to do anything with the other rows. Okay, now I can go ahead and add my index column. And I can invoke my custom function. Let's call this material color. This time, let's use function number 1. This works the same as the other one, simply takes an index and returns a color. Okay, there we go. Let's remove these two columns that we don't need and re-expand our table. So we have the table we had before, plus our new material color. Okay, now we're good to go. We can go ahead and start creating our report page. So we're going to close and apply this. The data sets are going to be refreshed as regular Power BI does. We can see we have our new walls table. Okay, before we actually create the report page, let's have a look at the model. So my new walls table was created. Power BI set up a couple of connections. Actually, in this case, we're not interested in any data connections, so we can go ahead and delete them right away. Okay, now we can go ahead and create our new report page. So let's start from the asset detail, duplicate the page. let's start using our new information. So we can call this walls, change also the title. Okay, now let's update the binding in the custom visual so that we're actually focusing in on the walls. So here in the bindings, remove the object ID coming from the Vcad asset and use the one coming from my walls table. Oh, sorry, over here. There we go. Okay, now if we go ahead and X-ray the rest of the model, or let's just hide completely, that way it's a little clearer. We could, of course, set up defaults for all of this, but we won't get into it right now. Let's actually update the rest of the report. So for starters, let's remove these slicers over here. And here, instead of a slicer, let's actually switch this to a card. And now in this card, what I want to see is the volume of material. Now we're looking at the total volume for all of the walls. Let's actually apply a filter on this visual based on my simple material column. And so this will allow me to say, in this card, only count based on the concrete. And so we can see that we have 507 cubic meters of concrete in my walls. Let's rename this real quick. We can call this concrete. Okay, and we can go ahead and duplicate this card over here. And you can switch this filter from concrete to instead show brick. So we can see that we have 1.67K cubic meters of brick. There we go, and we renamed it to brick. Now let's update the table so that we're showing the information of our walls. We can remove all of these. And for my walls, I can have a look at the name of the wall, the structural material, and the volume, so how much of that material there is. As before, because I told Power BI that the volume is a number, it was able to give me a total. But let's add in, again, a custom a bar chart. That way we can see the information based on its type. So I can drop in my bar chart over here. And for every structural material, I want to know just how much there is. And right away, I can see that the most used material in these walls that we're looking at right now is masonry brick, followed by gray brick facade. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's use that theme we defined. So I'm going to select my bar chart like we did before, go to the options, in the columns, pass in function, and for the function, use the field value. Pulling from my walls table, I want my material color. Let's apply that. There we go. And now let's apply the theme also to our actual model. So select the custom visual, head on over to the options, activate the theme selector, and then in the bindings, drop in the material color under the highlight color binding. Now we can select it and review the information. Fantastic. So now we can immediately see where the masonry brick walls are located in my building. I can see even graphically that they are clearly the most used material, followed by the gray brick facade. And if I want, I can have the information of how much of that material there is. Now we could go a little more advanced and add some tooltips. And actually, why don't I show you an example of a report where we went a little further. So we're going to stop with the presentation of this report, and we're going to show you what the final product can look like when you finish setting up some of the styles and some additional configuration. We're going to drop into the chat also the link to this report, which has been published, so that you can all go have a look at it right now. And it will also be available on our website. So if we want to have a look at the actual report, we can see it over here. So for our rooms, we didn't do much. We simply changed a bit of the theming. We set up some defaults for the X-ray mode. So when you first open up the report, it is like this. And then we switched the bar chart to a pie chart. Now keep in mind that the handy trick of the theme for the bar chart doesn't work for the pie chart. You need to kind of hack it a little. If we switch to the second page, here again we have our cards telling us the amount of concrete, the amount of brick. Again, switch to a pie chart, and the nice thing we did here is we added a tooltip so that when we hover over any object, any wall in our building, we get the information of the name of the wall, specifically what type of wall it is, coming from the symbol information, the specific structural material that is being used, and the volume for that specific object. So simply showing what can be achieved, adding a little more care to some transformations and some styling to the rest of the report. Keep in mind that we could have also have defined additional themes for our model. So here we're simply looking at material color, but we could have done a more generic theme based on the simple material. So basically dividing the model into two different colors to see what was concrete and what was brick. That would also have been a possibility. Okay, so here now we saw how simply with Vcad through some simple data transformation inside of Power BI, which is nothing weird or different from what we normally do in Power BI, how we can use the information of quantities of different materials and have access to the dimensions of our objects and stuff like that. I also want to take this opportunity to show you another report, which is the one I mentioned before, which is an example report using something we've been working on in the past month. So we've been working on a new data extraction for IFC models. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the report. We're not going to focus much on the actual report page section because that will be part of the new templates and those are going to change in the next day. So we're not going to focus on that. What I want to show you is the actual data set, because the very exciting thing is that with this new data extraction, we are more adherent to the IFC standard, which means that first off, we have a way more elaborate data set. But we don't need to let this scare us because we have the same information that has always been inside of our IFC files, but we have easier access to things like the materials or the quantities that can be extracted automatically in our template and allows us basically to show them as standalone datasets. Another exciting thing of this new data extraction is that we can better manage multi-site and multi-building scenarios, which before were a bit of a problem. So this opens a bunch of new scenarios and new avenues coming forward. We're at a good point in development of this new data extraction. And in the next weeks, we're going to be having a beta test period with a couple of our clients, after which it will be available to whoever wants it. So whoever wants to be using the new data extraction, we can set it up for their accounts basically, or they can continue with the data extraction that they've been using up until now. Okay, so with that said, I think we can we have a good idea of some of the possibilities. I'd like to get to some of the questions that have come up during the presentation. Let me just switch around a little. So let's go ahead and okay, so we can go ahead and I'll just pull up the questions and let's see what has been asked. Okay, question number one. So, and if you have any other questions as I go along, please go ahead and write them. No problem. So what if I have units in my model, for example, in meters, and I wanted them in feet? Okay, this is a very good example. So in my case, my model, my Revit model, had been set up to use the metered system, but often you have an imperial system or different units of measurement based on the type of measurement. There's no problem. Basically, the unit that is used inside of the original file, be this Revit, an Naviswork, IFC, whatever it is, will be available in Vcad, which means you have two ways to approach this. If you want to change the unit of measurement, you can either do it in the original file, if you have access to it. You simply change the information. You can then re-upload the model inside the Vcad, and the new extracted data will be using that unit of measurement. Or you can go ahead and set up some transformations in Power BI to do the conversion from one unit of measurement to the other. It's really up to you, depends on what you're trying to build. Okay, let's see. So what Autodesk application does Vcad work with? Okay, this is more of a generic question. I understand from the demo that it works with Revit, but does it work with other applications like AutoCAD or Plan 3D? Okay, so we don't have, the original software isn't that important. What is important is what file format it exports to. So basically, what you can do is with Vcad, you can manage Revit files like I just showed you. You can manage Navisworks files, you can manage DWG files, IFC files, and we also offer support for some minor formats like STLs and OBJs. We're also constantly looking into adding support for other file formats. So even in the future, or if you have any specific needs, reach out to us. Because if we see that there's a need for a specific file format, we may be able to work in that direction to offer support. But as of today, those are the file formats that we support. You can find a more detailed list on our website as well. Okay, so if I import other data from an external file, how do I relate them to the model elements as you did for materials? This is a very good question. A bit more of a generic case, but let's address it. So in general, the way the Vcad viewer, like you saw, is all based on that object ID that we use to switch from using the generic Vcad asset table to the more specific rooms table or the walls table. So what that means is that you can then connect your external data, however you prefer, to a data set that has that object ID. So ideally, what you would use is, for example, the external ID, which is it is a field that is used exactly to do this, to connect to external data sources. But that may not always be the case. In some cases, you may need to use, for example, some properties. So in some cases, you have a model, and inside of the properties of an object, you have, for example, a code that identifies the object. And you can access that kind of like what we did with the occupancy information. You could pull out that code and then use it to connect to external data. It's a very long way to say that. It really depends on the data that you're trying to connect and what your relationship is. But we give you total freedom as to how you actually do the connection. It really depends on the scenario. Okay. Okay, so in the Vcad custom visual, is it possible to use colors as functions rather than data bindings? Oh, this is a very interesting question. So it's actually coming, and we haven't talked about this before, but we can give you a sneak peek right now. This is something we're working on right now, switching some of the data bindings inside of the custom visual, allowing you to use them as functions in the properties, kind of like what we did with the bar chart. So in the future, yes, there will be different ways to connect colors to your model, depending on the scenario and what you're trying to do. Okay. How long does it take for the template to be ready to download from Vcad after uploading a BIM file? Okay, so we haven't shown that process in this presentation. We've shown it in previous presentations, so it's very simple. Once you've uploaded the model into Vcad and the first file processing has been completed, you can download a template and be ready to go in a matter of seconds. It's as simple as saying, I want to download a template, choose the template you want, and then you download it in a couple seconds, and then you can open it in Power BI Desktop and start editing it or changing it to create your final report. Is it possible to create the same type of report as for quantities, but by levels? Yes, definitely. Two ways to do that. This depends slightly on the file format you're using. So if you're using a Revit file, it'll look, the structure will look like the one we saw today. So you'll have a Vcad levels table available. Depending on how your original Revit file was compiled, that table will be compiled with all of the information, and you can start using that one. If you're using an IFC file, then you'll have a floors table available. Or in general, if you have the information of the levels as a property of your objects, which is normally the case also for Revit files, you can then do some transformations and retrieve that information for the information for your report creation. Can we just a second? I need to make this a little bigger. Okay. Can we do a dashboard, merge wall, floors, etc. to manipulate all types at the same time? Yes, definitely. So in this case, we sort of filtered down the data to narrow the case scenario and keep it a little easier to follow along. So we only focus at once for the rooms and for the walls. You could definitely do the same thing for a larger subset of objects or all of your objects all at once. You're free to do the transformations however you prefer. Again, one of our main goals here when we're developing Vcad is giving you as much freedom as possible to do what you want. So yes, definitely you can do multiple at a time. I would keep an eye out for performance. If you're creating a huge data set, you need to make sure that Power BI is still able to handle that large of a data set. But I have to say that Power BI's engine is quite powerful, so you'll probably be good with that. What is meant by slots for? Okay, so this doesn't have anything to do with the presentation, but we'll have a quick note on the slots. So the slot is basically the unit of measurement that we use for the licensing for Vcad. A slot is, you can think of it as a container for your model. Basically, it is what the actual report is connecting to when it's connecting to data and rendering the model. Very complex way to say that basically one slot is equals one file. Of course, slots are reusable. So over time, if you're done with your project, you can go ahead, clear out a slot and upload a new model to it. Again, you're free to do as you prefer. If you want a little more detailed of an explanation, you can definitely find it on our website or maybe reach out to us either by email or on LinkedIn. Both to me or my colleague Francesco Necciari, we're definitely available to talk a little more about that. Okay, let me see another question. Can I use markers in the rooms and see on the mouse hover the quantities? Okay, so this is from someone that has seen other presentations. Yes, one of the features available in Vcad is markers, and markers can be applied to objects in the model. That includes rooms. So for example, the case that we saw today, we simply saw the data in other visuals, but you could have done something a little more elaborate, kind of like what you're describing. So add a marker to the room, or simply add a tooltip to the hover on the room, but probably a marker would have been the cleaner way. And when interacting with the marker, display a tooltip that gives you the quantities information. So yes, absolutely. And that would actually be a very interesting use case to have a look at maybe in the future. Will it work with SketchUp file format? So about that, we'll probably refer you to my colleague, or I'll get back to you later with more information on that. But in general, what you can definitely do is convert the file into one of the supported file formats. And specifically SketchUp, I think we have some client that has worked with them in the past. So I'll get back to you offline. That way I can give a little more of a complete answer to the question. Okay, so I'm sorry, I think we're running out of time. There's a couple questions I didn't get to. We'll definitely reach out to you after this webinar through email and or through the platform. to answer your question. But for now, I'm afraid we need to end the presentation. Yeah, so let's go ahead and close this up real quick. Okay, so I'd like to, before I close, absolutely thank everyone for coming out and following along with the presentation, for all the good questions, and actually a lot of good insight for us to sort of think about. Again, thank you for reaching out. Stay tuned for more webinars coming in the future, and also a bunch of material both on our website and on our YouTube page, as I mentioned before. With that, thank you, everyone. You have a nice day.